as usual, and as it should be, I really just want to acknowledge the New Knuckle people and their elders, the past elders, the present, and those who will be elders. And one of the things I want to say as a precursor is that I think it's wonderful to acknowledge those who are the Indigenous people of this country, because you realise just how many tribes, I guess, groups of people that there really are. And the other thing is that that whole notion of terra nullius obviously disproved, and I'll share with you the idea that I was a child who was,
I need you to give me
right, that I was a child who was regarded as being a terra nullius child, and I'll explain what that means a little bit later. For those of you who are watching and for recording, it's wonderful to have two people sharing with me, and that's Amy Gill, and I've got her bio here, and it's fascinating. She spent her adolescence in kinship, residential and foster care in the US. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well as we go through that, Amy. And after completing an undergraduate degree, she moved to the UK for a working holiday and later Australia, and came out here and was a primary school teacher for nearly 10 years before completing a master's thesis looking at the cross-system collaborations to strengthen educational outcomes among care-experienced young people in WA. Amy's working towards her PhD at the University of Sydney, exploring service needs among care-experienced young people in New South Wales. One aim of this project is to identify stakeholders' recommendations for preventing intergenerational out-of-home care. She lives in Brisbane, Maruka, yes, with her husband and a 3-year-old daughter. I live just down the road from her. And it's very, very nice to welcome Stacey Page, who's experienced informal kinship care, and we'll talk about what that means as well, from the age of 2 years old until 14 years old, then informal foster care for a short time at 16. I've had a little bit of experience at that, but we're really looking forward to you sharing with us about that as well before moving out on her own. At 14, you dropped out of high school, well, and began a 10-year career in hairdressing and makeup artistry. After having a son at age 24, you enrolled in uni to study psychology, and your whole life changed for the better. That's terrific. Currently studying a PhD in psychology at the University of Adelaide School of Psychology. Research has a focus on hairdressers and beauty workers as informal caregivers to their clientele, the topics clients disclose, and the process of emotional labour. That sounds interesting. Look, I only go to a barber, and just lately I've stopped doing that because my wife's decided to cut my hair. But I can remember when I was a kid going off to a barber and these old blokes talking to me about racehorses and whatever. I didn't have a clue as to what they were talking about. But we're here tonight, and we're going to talk for a little about history, out-of-home care, how we survived, all of those kinds of things. I think it's probably very important to put things into perspective, and to look at the fact that in England and Australia, the whole notion of care, out-of-home care, children being placed into care, has run for over 300 years. And one of the first examples of out-of-home care, for want of a better term, of course, was in the 1600s when Britain exported, pinched, kidnapped over 100 children off the streets of London, took them off to America because the British had done some terrible things to the native Indians there, and there was a massacre, and so they wanted to prop up the population there. So they just took 100 kids off the streets of London. That's amazing. Until the 1970s, you found places like Barnardo's and the Salvation Army bringing children out here for whatever purpose. Many of them ending up in out-of-home care. And the reason, as Bernardo said, that they stopped bringing children out in the 1970s because they ran out of children. And that's quite amazing, isn't it, to actually run out of children, and to see that the Australian government, the English government, all those other governments were very happy to have kids taken, placed everywhere you can possibly think of, and it was all legislated. So so we want to look at that, and one of the things is that one of the reasons, though, I thought it was good to look at this is that I'm using an old American scholar here, a bloke called Peter Lyman, who said, how do we learn from history that we live? He answers his own question. We learn, he says, not from the formal chronicle events, but from the subjective feelings and thoughts with which we experience the events of our everyday lives. There's no other way to write history, real way to write it. And one of the things that has come out for me in this is history. And so I want to start at the very beginning and then hand over to you guys, talk to you guys. And to start at the very beginning, I need to look at my mother. Wow. I really don't know my mother. She died when I was 4. And she was a person who was in out-of-home care. She ended up being placed in care at age 2 in Newcastle because her mother, my grandmother, who I obviously never met, had a bit of a breakdown, and her father, unable to look after the girls, had them placed into care. Kept the boys because the boys were going to be really terrific on the farm. So you kept the boys, but you got rid of the girls because they were going to be too much problem. So my mother was put into care at age 2 and shipped off, and had her name changed. And her name was changed to, what was it? Instead of Kathleen Alsop, she became known as Sylvia Warren. In care, she was adopted, placed into care, and had her name changed. And to the end of her days, which she died when she was in her 30s, she had suffered a lack of identity. And I think from one of the things that I did with the readings that Dee sent to me, some of those things, I looked at the readings, and some of to me, the things that came out mostly, and with papers from the UK and from Denmark and from Australia, the things that really stood out most was a lack of people in care, out-of-home care and in care, suffered from a lack of identity and self-esteem. And I guess the two are related. Just in that, did either of you have your names changed at all, or you were always the same? It was quite a common thing to do, by the way. Wow. Change names.
I've never heard of that. Certainly didn't happen to me. But I was also much older when I entered care. I was about 13, so I knew my name, and my identity was pretty firmly established. It definitely changed. My identity changed.
Yes. In what way?
I guess, in what way didn't it? That's an interesting question. At the time, I guess once you are removed from your family, the stigma that comes with that became a big part of my identity. And so in new schools, being known as the foster kid, and all of the assumptions about that, I was always academically inclined. So my teachers in my school, when they realized that I was from that house, were actually quite astonished. So I had a hard time reconciling the identity and all of the traits that come with being a foster kid of you know, being poorly behaved in school or not interested in learning or whatnot. Those things didn't apply to me, but I think it did give me a chance to also recognize at a much younger age than my peers who had also experienced abuse to sort of assimilate that into my identity as well as being a survivor of abuse in a way that my peers had just sort of begun that journey when they entered university. But that was something that had already become a part of my identity because I was removed from my family. So I had to, I guess, acknowledge that earlier on. And for me personally, as you said in the introduction, I was in kinship care, didn't work out, and then I was in residential care. And in the US, they tried to move you from residential to family placements. There are a lot more family placements. My understanding is, yeah, there are a lot more family placements for teenagers than there are in Australia. So the family placement I was in the same family for 3.5 years, so that they became part of my identity. They're still a part of my life. And I was the token white kid in that household. Everyone else was American. So that definitely changed my, I guess, a lot of cultural norms, subtle things, you know, so that became part of my identity as well. Yeah. And now, of course, having being a former care leaver is a large part of my identity as it relates to the research that I'm doing with my PhD, for example. So, yeah.
It's interesting the impact that it has on you as a person, then, doesn't it? That ongoing impact. Okay. Oh yeah. Sorry.
Did you want me to answer as well?
Oh yeah. Yes. Sorry. Yes, I was.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. No, you're fine. Please.
Yeah. No. I struggled with identity and self-esteem until only, I think I was about 30 once I started to gain any self-esteem or any you know, my first identity was being a mum at 24. Before that, it was I just had no idea who I was. I had no one really caring. So when my mum had her car accident, I was put into the kinship care, and it was informally done. So there was no one monitoring the situation. And my mum was working in a brothel at the time as a prostitute, and she was in a lesbian relationship. So when she had her car accident, I didn't really have anyone to look after me except for my mum's family, who I'd never met. And they hated my guts. They thought that I was the worst ever. So they made me realize that I didn't deserve to kind of be with them or be as good as them.
Why did they?
I suppose because they saw my mum as, you know, one of the black sheep of the family. I mean, she came from a family of 9, and you know, they all kind of thought that they'd overcome their past when they had never dealt with it, but they just had a lot of hate for me, and they just resented the fact that they had to look after me, and they just, you know, would call me things like secondhand Rose. And I was born severely cross-eyed, so I had my eyes all the way cross-eyed, and you know, like they'd always say that I'd end up, you know, a hooker or a prostitute or something like that. They just had no regard for me in any way, and you know, they really made that well known. And then because no one actually wanted to keep me there, I had to go between 10 different homes with all my mum's aunties and uncles. So it would just be like a week here, 2 weeks there, 3 months here, and they would just keep getting rid of me. And I don't think I was really a terrible child. I think I did my best to be a good kid. Something that was never sort of recognised as a young person was my inability to read social situations and my inability to, you know, learn properly. So I was always eager to learn, but struggled quite a bit. And I was taken out of school a lot as well. And it wasn't until I had my son and I learned what autism was that I ended up getting diagnosed myself and with ADHD. And that made a bunch of sense. But because there was no one helping me to look after that kind of stuff. It was never like considered. And when my son was born, like quite severely autistic, and it was extremely obvious because he had the intellectual disability too, that was when I had to learn about what it all was, because I couldn't work it out. I just thought he was the same as me. And then also I was, at that same time, I just started my university degree, and my ex-partner, who's my son's father, was a very violent man and didn't want me to get an education. And my son was going through his diagnosis, and it was just, you know, I was listening to all this stuff about attachment style and, you know, bad parents and how mothers, you know, cause all the problems. So I couldn't quite work it out what was happening. And but then once, you know, once Presley got his diagnosis and then I got mine, you know, things got a lot better. And once I left my ex, you know, and I was in a safe environment, our lives have flourished. It's been amazing. I can't believe I've actually been out, because I'm dyslexic as well. I can't spell and couldn't read until I was 14. I still can't read an analog clock, only digital. You know, constantly say the wrong thing, miss cues and whatnot. You know, but after a 10-year degree in psychology, I've sort of picked up what most people would generally pick up just in general life. But yeah, it's been a long time. And yeah, so basically my first identity was, you know, a mum, and my second identity kind of, you know, emerged into that as a university student, and now PhD student.
Lovely. I think that's terrific. Thank you for sharing that with us. And again, thank you to both of you for your honesty. And I think, pardon me, that's one of the things that we will see coming from tonight, is that we'll be honest. One of the things that you were saying, there's a lady called Judith Herman who wrote a book about trauma and recovery. And she said that children in abusive environments, in order to survive, become superb performers. Mm-hmm. They do whatever is required of them and can become academic achievers, a model of social conformity. But it comes at a price, because in many ways it's inauthentic and false. And I hadn't really thought of that we become superb performers. That's an interesting term, isn't it? That in surviving care, you're actually a superb performer. I guess that kind of applies to us. Going back to my mother, she ended up in a home, and she ran away from that home. She doesn't have much of a liking for the Catholic Church for some reason or other. I don't know why. But she was then placed in Parramatta Girls' Home, which was a notorious institution. And one of the things that, again, you may or may not know is that children in care, from my era and from her era, was that if the courts got hold of you, you would be charged. Now, as a boy, I would have been charged as being uncontrollable. So everybody was uncontrollable. And if you're a girl, age 2, 3 or 4 or whatever, you were in moral danger. So you needed to be taken out of moral danger. And at that time, the institutions that my mother ended up in, at whatever young age, every girl sadly was given an internal examination to ensure that they had no sexually transmitted diseases. That was common, very, very common. So anyway, my mother married a bloke eventually, who came back from the Second World War. He did some terrible and nasty things, and that was probably due to his experiences in the Middle East and in New Guinea. But, you know, I still can't really, accept his behaviour, and she ended up divorcing him. Now, I don't know if you know how and why, and, well, the reasons that women could give for a divorce. Do you know the only reason that you could get out of the marriage? The husband, her husband, got out of the marriage, not because he was, he was violent. He offered to come back. He said he would move to a house that was near a bus stop so she could catch a bus and go and do work. But the only way you could get a divorce then was for him to say that she was denying him his conjugal rights. In other words, not giving him sex. So therefore, he was able to get a divorce. Women were treated very, very poorly and badly then. My mum ended up in a relationship with another soldier. She committed the cardinal sin of not getting married, and I was born. Oh. Might have brought joy to her, but she then did the wrong thing by dying in her 30s, and she didn't leave a will. And so that meant that she died intestate. Now, here we come to the interesting thing, because she died and my father's name, although I know it wasn't put on on my birth certificate, and because my parents weren't married, it meant that I was classed as illegitimate. And the obvious thing there is, when you look at children, is that it was a different concept that you weren't legitimate. In other words, you weren't real. That whole concept of Karen Nullius, you didn't exist as a child. And so the public trustee, when they settled the account of my mother, I wasn't entitled to anything. And I've got a little letter here. It comes from Legacy, and it says that my three siblings, who are a lot older than I, they were fine. But because my father's name wasn't on the birth certificate, they couldn't do anything, even though he was obviously a soldier, and even though he had notified them and said, look, this is my son, but they said, well, Jim's name is Jim Luthy, your name's Fred Drayton, so therefore nothing can be done. So I was put into care. A next door neighbour who was going to look after me. She was a single lady, and she was going to look after me and my sister. My sister's was intellectually impaired, and the condition was that the rest of my family, my brother and other two sisters, not contact me. And so I was put into non-residential care, but placed in this house of a person who was how can I say this, a religious nutter. And so I began life like that. Now, one of the interesting things from reading, with you two guys, with you sharing, is that I never went through the court system. I was just put into a house, and you could do that with children.
Yeah, none of my care was formalised. It was all
it wasn't formalised. So you never show up on records or anything like that. How, Stacey? How about Amy? I'm sorry. How about it with you? Was yours all formalised?
Yeah. Well, my care became formalised when I was came to the attention of Child Protection from my kinship placement, and so then that's when it became formalized. So because Child Protection were not happy about the fact that I had been informally placed, particularly when I went from sort of one bad situation to another, not nearly as many or as long as Stacey, you described, but when you were describing the fact that your own family didn't want you, that is strongly what I felt too. And so as a result, I felt rejected. There were a lot of issues, and those eventually Child Protection did become involved. And so at that point, yes, it became a formal care situation. So they took emergency custody to at the time to just determine what was going on, I suppose, but ultimately it was decided that nobody in my family was safe. So then I was still deemed emergency or temporary. Nobody quite knew. I was 13 or 14 at the time, and that just continued until I was emancipated, because that is the term that we used in the 2000s to describe a person exiting care in the US.
How do you feel about that term? You were emancipated. What?
Well, I mean, at the time, I wanted to be set free. The horrible connotations of slavery
Yes,
are
I was just thinking that. Yes.
yeah, are problematic because of the racialized elements of slavery and everything else about slavery. But the idea of someone having complete control over your life and then no longer is pretty accurate.
You know, it's a term that I've really never heard in regards to care. Stacey, have you heard that term used at all?
The only time I've heard it was the Emancipation of Harley Quinn, that TV show. That's it.
Fair enough. Look, it's really quite fascinating. I think in Australia, just from what I can gather from people that I spoke to, it's always been we were just chucked out, which is a little different from emancipation. Oh, that's a fascinating word. I just find it really quite interesting.
Frank Golding, and I'm very, very interested in this topic. In fact, I'm writing a book about 5 generations in care, including 2 of my aunties. So 5 generations, 16 different institutions, all in the state of Victoria, and
Lucky.
33 individual people so far. But I just wanted to come in on that terminology, emancipation. In Victoria, I was charged as a neglected child with that crime, and there's various legal and penal terms really associated with the process through the system. But at the end of the day, yes, we were just chucked out, but they formally called it discharged.
Yes.
So we were discharged from the care of the state. Emancipated actually has a nicer connotation, doesn't it?
Yes,
you know, freedom.
Yeah, freedom.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah.
Stacey, were you sorry?
Sorry, I just said yes. For me, it was just freedom, basically. But yeah, I mean, I kind of wish that there was a formal process, because then my family couldn't abuse me as much as they did. And you know, with the whole informal foster situation, it wasn't until I was 16 when I met some people at church, and they sort of took me under their wing and let me rent their granny flat, and that was the informal foster care side of things. But all of that was all informal, so there was no kind of feeling of freedom, because I still felt lost the whole time. And because I walked straight into a relationship with a psychopath, I stuck in that for 8 years. And then after that was when I finally felt freedom. And it wasn't until 2013 when I met Dee, because I couldn't work out why I was crying so much through discussions about stolen generation and kids going to foster care, because I didn't think that my situation applied. And then when she said to me that there was this thing called informal kinship care, I burst into tears and I cried in her office for God knows how long. And it just made sense. I thought, oh my God, this makes sense. And then after I'd been invited to write in the book with Deidre, my nana passed away. And when I was talking to some cousins at my nana's funeral, and I mentioned that I'd written about my being in informal kinship care, they were so angry at me, and most of them actually stopped talking to me and disowned me completely after that.
Yeah, look, it's interesting. I didn't realise Frank's graduated when? Last year, was it, Frank, or the year before? With his doctorate?
Yeah, last year.
Last year, yes. Yeah. Look, and Frank's our geriatric doctor. No, he's not really. I've known Frank for quite a while. We've shared a few battles with, particularly with the Salvation Army at times. So it's great to see you. It really is great to see you. Going on from me, I lived in this environment where there was no recognition of me, I guess, as a person. And the thing was that because you were placed in this situation, and because it was a lady who had a church background, she was considered to be quite good. And so therefore she could just look after me. Which brings me to another interesting point just with care. There's a book written by a lady called Joanna Pangloss, Dr. Joanna Pangloss, published by University of Western Australia. And in it she talks about, the book's called Orphans of the Living. In it she talks about the institution in which she lived, which was a private institution. And I don't know if you really knew about private, I never knew about private institutions, but they were simply homes that people ran in order to buy a home and pay off a mortgage. And so you could take up to 12 children into this particular house, to the home, in order to make some money. I think one of the fascinating things that came out from that was that in order to run a home, or in order to look after children, you didn't need any qualifications or anything like that. All you needed to do was to be a woman to look after children, and you needed to be of good moral character, whatever that meant. And so if you were a woman and of good moral character and you had a big house, you could create a business for yourself by looking after children. Now, it had to be registered, but nobody really checked terribly often. And Frank can share with you how often the home he was in was checked, as with me. And so I was in this very informal situation with a lady who was looking after me from age of 4, and nobody checked. She could do whatever she wanted. It was brutal, to say the least. And from there, just before I go on from there, one of the things that I think that we never experienced that I never experienced as a child growing up there was laughter and fun. And, the other thing that I never experienced was tears. Because I was a boy, and so it was wrong to cry, toughen up, But I don't know about joy. I don't know that we actually experienced much joy.
Yeah.
Any comments on joy, happiness, tears?
I had very little joy in my life. I couldn't recall. I remember when I was 12 years old and I was seeing some mental health care workers, and they were asking me to try and think of something that had made me feel happy or joyful that had happened in my life. There was not one thing I could think of.
Isn't that's sad, isn't it? Amy, what do you think?
I just remembered being asked as a 6-year-old to write about what it felt like to be hugged. And I told my teacher I'd never been hugged before. I didn't know what it felt like. So yeah, there was very little joy in my childhood as well. I think I thought as soon as I was emancipated that suddenly life would be great.
Again, yes.
Yeah. That suddenly there would be joy in my life, but it was a long struggle to, I guess, heal from all of the trauma before I could find joy, which is why I think I put so much effort into making sure my daughter has a happy childhood. I go to great lengths to make sure she can experience that.
So you agree with that, Stacey?
Oh my God,
yeah.
Everything I do is for my son. Like, if I didn't have my son, I probably wouldn't have the will to live. He means more to me. Like, I can't imagine him going through what I went through. Like, it makes me want to cry. Like, because I feel like, just driving him to school, if I had a car accident, he'd have no one. It would just there would be no one to look after him, and that can't happen. So everything I've done has been for him, and he's just been, he's hard work, but I just love him with everything I've got, and I want to make sure that he has, the best life possible. So as soon as I'd come to terms with his diagnosis, I've managed to get him into special education, which is so hard to do. There's such little places for children in special needs. and you know, he'll be 11 in April, so it's been 11 years. And you know, when he was 3 was when I first left my ex, because he was becoming aware of the abuse going on, and he couldn't talk until he was about 4 or 5. But you know, there was just, I couldn't allow him to go through what I went through, and I was told that it's child abuse to keep your child in a domestic violence situation. You know, and I knew my ex was either going to kill me, or you know, there was something, you know, he threatened that all the time. So I didn't want me and my son to end like without a quality of life. So everything I did, the reason that I left, the reason that I got my you know, my uni degrees, is, you know, to make sure that my son has a good role model, someone that he can look up to, and you know, and offer him opportunities, because I've only ever known poverty. So by the time I've finished my degree and get a job, I'll be able to support him, because he'll need me to look after him for his whole life.
Yes, yes, and we might look at that notion of poverty as well. For care leavers. Frank, what about you? We'll bring Frank in on the conversation as well. Frank, joy.
Joy happened perhaps once or twice a year. We had egg appeals. I'm talking about a big institution for the most of the time. I was in 3 different institutions, but the one that I basically remember was about 10 years, 11 years in the Ballarat orphanage, which had 200 children, girls and boys. And once or twice a year, like an egg appeal, and we'd have eggs. Never for the rest of the year. And then at Christmas time, Father Christmas would become thinly disguised, well, actually quite fatly disguised, a member of the board of this home, and we would get little plastic toys and things which would last about 2 weeks. They were joyful times, but most of the time I spent wondering why the hell I was there. I wasn't an orphan. I knew I wasn't an orphan because my parents would very occasionally come to visit, but my father would come sometimes drunk and would be told that's the last visit you'll ever pay. So, you know, it was a place that was violent too. You were never far from that fear that you were going to be bashed or that you were going to be raped in bed. You know, is it my turn tonight? So joy is not an emotion that I was joyful when I got out.
Emancipated.
When I was emancipated.
There you go.
And can I just say, in contrast to the other guests, Jim, I went back to my parents at the age of 15. And that might sound wonderful, but actually it was really hard, because if you've been in care since the age of 2 and you're suddenly thrown into a family home, how do you act? What's it like to be a teenager in a family if you've never had a mother and father until then? So it was really quite stressful, and there were moments when it was far from joyful. Even then.
Even then, it's interesting you're talking about eggs, because I can remember one Christmas the Salvation Army gave us a boiled egg as a Christmas present. So that was absolutely marvelous. We got a boiled egg.
Yeah.
Just moving on from there, I eventually ended up in a place called the Gill Memorial Home for Boys at Goulburn. My guardian popped me in there, and you won't be able to see this, but it's a home application form, and it basically says, and the Clan Museum's got a copy of mine. It simply says, was I deformed in any way? Was I suffering diseases? No. Was I illegitimate? Yes. My father's name, not known. My mother's name, deceased. Do I have any more relations? No, even though I had brothers and a brother and sisters. And so that was it. And so with those few words, you could be placed into residential care. And when I asked the Salvation Army about this, they said, so long as somebody paid the money, you were fine. There were no checks. There didn't need to be. There didn't need to be any checks. Which leads me on to the whole idea, and I guess asking you, Amy, and Stacey there about checks. Did anybody ever bother to check up? Was there any government checkups? There certainly wasn't with me, but was there with you at a latter stage? You know, obviously from when Frank and I were in care.
Maybe that's
Never for me.
fundamental
Yeah, no.
difference.
Sorry.
Oh, you're
Yeah.
saying no, so it's maybe that's a fundamental difference between formal and informal care.
Yeah.
Because I had extensive, endless oversight in my foster home. It was excessive. It was annoying. You know, I couldn't do anything, even though I was in a family situation for that time. I couldn't do anything that a normal family would do. I had to get permission to, like, I think I stayed at a friend's house once or twice, but it involved so much paperwork to go to a sleepover that we just, yeah, and even things like school excursions, having to get permission from the states. At one point, my foster parents wanted to take us on a holiday interstate, and that was, they had to get permission from, they would take on 5 teenage girls at a time. Over a long period, they had over 77 foster kids by the end. And when I was there, we wanted to go on a holiday, and so we had to get permission from caseworkers, all 5 of us. I almost didn't get to go because my paperwork wasn't coming through. But weirdly enough, when I was in a residential situation, there was very little oversight. There were a lot of inappropriate staff members. There were a lot of things that shouldn't happened that did, but nobody seemed to care. There was no questions asked there, but it was only in the family situation where there was a lot of involvement from the foster care agency.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, no, I never had any checkups at all. And I was told that the reason for that was because when my mum's doctor became aware of some of the abuse I was going through, they thought that if they'd gone through the formal situation, my mum would never see me again. And she threatened to kill herself if she never got to have me again. So they basically just did like a little behind the scenes deal with a few of my aunties to see who would be looking after me. But it was never checked on. And yeah, they basically said so I could see my mum again. And I'd be going back and forth to my mum's as well as to everyone else's home. You know, one of my aunties would come and check on me every now and then at my mum's when she was looking after me. And my mum has always been on like opioid medication. She's on fentanyl patches at the moment. So she'd be off, you know, she was on morphine and pethidine. So she'd be off in like a little zombie world, and I'd be trying to cook food because she would get me to look after her when I was with her instead of her looking after me. So I'd be trying to make food and I'd almost burn the house down, and I was so malnourished, and I'd be walking around the streets and all that sort of stuff. And I'd go try and watch TV with my neighbours and stuff like that. No one checked, you know, and if they were to look into the kinship background, so apparently these days, kinship foster care doesn't happen if there is a history of abuse in the family. So my grandfather was a pedophile who raped his children, or like most of them. And, you know, one of the reasons my mum's a lesbian is because of that. And then also as a sex worker, she was, you know, and then turns out one of her clients was who my biological father was. So, you know, there was just no, you know, if they were to go formally, then they wouldn't have given me to my kinship care with the amount of abuse and history of abuse and pedophilia and all sorts that went on. So yeah, that was disappointing. And it wasn't until that I, when I started going to a church at 16, where a family realised just how broken I was, and asked me to move in with them in their granny flat. But then that only lasted 6 months because they had a baby and they didn't have any room for me anymore. So I got kicked out of that too. And that's when I just stayed on my own for the rest of that time. I haven't been on my own since then, basically. Yeah.
Well, Frank, you wouldn't have had any people, well, you wouldn't have gone on school excursions anyway, if you anything like the Sallys.
The primary school was on site, and it went
Yes.
to grade 8. Fortunately, just as I was getting to that stage, they decided they'd send a couple of the bright ones, and I put that in inverted commas, to the high school. So 4 of us out of 200 in my year went to high school, and that was the start of something quite exciting there. But just on that question of visits and so on, I have all of my files, and there are hundreds of pages, and I think perhaps 3 years I had a brief report from inspector. I have no memory of being inspected, but it found things like, I found things on my file that said, a nice type of boy takes good care of his teeth. And that was, that was the insight that she had of me. Though I can't think how I took good care of my teeth, because we had no toothbrushes. She had to write something, I suppose. But this was in the day, and I'm not sure it's a good thing that it's gone. That social workers were not around. We had these inspectors.
Yes.
I don't know they had any qualifications or knew anything about children.
No, they didn't.
They would come in, maybe every second, third year, and write a little note like, takes good care of his teeth, and go away again. And meanwhile, the rape and the bashings went on.
Yeah, isn't that amazing? Isn't that it's fascinating, just the way that those things happen. Of course, obviously that happened with the Salvation Army as well. And it was quite amazing the good food that suddenly appeared when there was an inspector coming around.
Yes.
But just moving on from there, because we're looking at our lives, I guess. The home that I was in, just by the way, was fairly brutal. And if you know anything about from the Royal Commission, you'll know that the Salvation Army, of course, brutalised children. The lady that I spoke about before, Joanna Penglas, she said this about the place that I was at. This home, because of its brutality, mindless discipline and sheer cruelty to children, was among the worst. The rituals and routines of institutional life, which I described in a previous chapter, were here intensified into a regime which appears designed purely to oppress the spirit, break the will, and destroy the hope of any boy who lived there. So it was a wonderful, cheery environment to go. And then finally to leave. Now here, I want to come across, another thing, because Frank said that he went home to his parents, and suddenly I was sent back to my guardian for a little while. She was a teacher, and she got a promotion as the deputy principal. We're living in New South Wales, to Burke. Now, at Burke, there's nothing. The back of Burke, there is absolutely nothing after Burke. It's a town in the middle of nowhere. They grow cotton, and that's about it. So I was doing an apprenticeship. I was an apprentice chef. I got a job as an apprentice chef. And I guess I was living below the poverty line, because I wasn't allowed to keep my money if I was living in this place with her. I had to give it to her, and it was embarrassing. I was embarrassed about going to work, because everybody else, the other guys, used to wear clothes that their mother had bought for them, or that they had bought, but I had to wear clothes that I got from the op shop, and that was really embarrassing, and to be laughed at, I guess, by these guys, and that was again one of the things about living in this environment. I was living in the house, but never really a part of a family, never really a part of a household. And in fact, it wasn't until I ended up having my appendix out and living in a family for 3 days. I was allowed to come and stay with the family for 3 days. It actually was in a house where there was what we might call a normal family, mother, father, and 3 children. And I'd never ever been in a house like that before. So I was ashamed and embarrassed as a 16, 17-year-old, because I looked so different from everybody else. They all had really tight clothes on, jeans and whatever. I had big baggy things.
Can I look at Cecil, please?
And I think that's one of the other things that I think with people who,
Sure,
mate,
yeah.
that I think has really marked, and is one of the things that really showed with some of the research there, that we suffered great embarrassment due to the way that we lived. Amy, did you experience any of that?
Yeah. The first thing that came to my mind when you're talking about that sort of stigma is I remember going or being sent to these events that were for, like, oh, it's hard to explain. It was like a night of a charity night. A charity put on some sort of fun event for, you know, the poor kids in need, and so normal kids were made to volunteer to put on a banquet, and there was some entertainment, and the whole thing was just excruciatingly painful because
Can I just interrupt you there? Your
Kitty
comment,
associated.
normal kids, the normal
Yeah.
kids, yeah,
normal kids with their normal families, you know,
yes.
living with their families of origin, who had, I guess, middle-class values and middle-class experiences, and yeah, so it was quite hard. When I left out of home care, I remember experiencing stigma then as well, when I first went to university. So when other people were talking about their family experiences and getting gifts and whatnot, and I mentioned that everything I had came from the state, you know, that a foster care agency, that your parents' taxpayers actually paid for anything that I had. That did not go down well with my peers. They were not very pleased to think of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, all my stuff was from op shops and hand-me-downs.
Yes. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, that we experienced all of that stuff. Frank?
Well, you know, that my equivalent was at school lining up for books, free books for the kids from the orphanage, whereas all the rest put in their book orders and paid their money. We had no money to pay, but they didn't expect it. But they would say to us, "You just wait there, just wait at the end of the line, and we'll get to you." And then at the end of the line, they would give us our free books, and everyone knew, of course, why we were getting free books.
Yes.
It was so embarrassing.
Yeah. It's interesting that you raised the point about school, and I just want to go back to that point, and I think Stacey was talking about something to do with school as well, and I think that one of the things was, and I went to the local high school, was that you were seen as a homeboy, and therefore you were dumb. You were seen as a homeboy, therefore you were never going to make it. You were seen as a homeboy, therefore you didn't have to do the homework because there was no reason to, because you would either end up the other end of Goulburn, which was where the jail was, or you would go into the army. So homeboys didn't have to do anything at all like that. So again, at school, I think, and I think you had spoke about this, Stacey, you were almost stigmatized.
Yeah, well, a lot of people didn't understand that it was an out-of-home care situation. I didn't get it all. They knew that my mum wasn't with me, and there was a lot of times I was taken out of the main school I was in and put into other schools that my cousins went to just for a term or so. I had a lot of disrupted education.
So how many schools do you think you went to?
Okay, so I remember going to about 3 different kindies, and then I went to one particular main primary school, and then I ended up having to go to 2 or 3 different ones when I was staying with other people, which was very sort of short-lived experiences, and then ended up having to go back to the original school, which I got bullied horrendously at. I used to have an eye patch on one of my eyes, and you know, my mum was, you know, in a wheelchair when she was around, and, you know, she was on drugs, and people knew she was a lesbian, and I'd never learnt any lying or social stuff. So people would ask me questions and I would just say the answer. And then people would say that I was retarded, or I was dumb, or I was ugly or useless, and, you know, ask me if I was a pirate and all that sort of thing because I had an eye patch. All my clothes didn't fit. I used to wear hand-me-downs that, you know, were 3 or 4 sizes too big. So I was ostracized just for being a very odd kid in it anyway. I mean, later on I learned about, you know, being on the autism spectrum, and, you know, I used to try and make friends with the girls that were refugees from Bosnia, because a lot of them couldn't speak very good English, and I didn't require English. I just required someone to sit next to me. But even they didn't want to sit next to me, and even they would steal my lunch money. So I was at the very bottom of the hierarchy in school. And then when I got to high school, oh God, it was a nightmare. I got bullied so bad that I had to drop out and get an apprenticeship.
Yeah. Amy, did you have any of those experiences?
I went to 5 high schools in year 9. That was when my care went from informal. Well, that was the year.
Yes.
I had lots of placement moves. And I remember at one of those high schools being instructed to sit at this specific table that was for new kids. And so there was myself, another student who was in like a foster family placement, and then a girl who lived outside of her family in an informal placement. And so it was nowhere near the horrendous experiences that Stacey was just describing, but it definitely, you definitely know you're being othered. And this high school was, I was allowed, like Frank, I was allowed to go to real school from my residential. So, and also that set me apart as well, because I couldn't go for the full day. So it was very much, people were aware of me. And the suburb where this particular residential facility or institution was in a quite high socioeconomic place. So the public school I was in was very fancy and had all sorts of fancy things. And so I stood out significantly there because of it, and also the transient nature of it, because me being allowed to attend, you know, a mainstream school didn't happen at the start of the school year so smoothly. So I was also new, and yeah, it was very obvious.
Sorry. That's an interesting point you made about the social economic of the area and standing out more so. Whereas one of the reasons that, I don't know if, actually I don't know if this is a reason or not, but the area that I went to primary school in, the main one was well known for drugs and crime, and a lot of kids would come to school with black eyes and stuff like that. So, you know, everyone had come from a rough area. I just had this extra kind of weird kind of social misunderstanding, and just really lacked the ability to find friends. Even kids that had situations where, you know, they'd been in foster care and people knew about it, they'd got more help than I did, because no one really knew what was going on, and I didn't understand. But I'm one of those people that I come across very naive, and I'll believe every single thing I'm told like it's a fact. So that was quite funny for a lot of people to tell me stories that I would believe, and see how long before I would, you know, work it out, which was never. Yeah, so it was, you know, I was just a big joke for everyone, basically. I mean, yeah, very awkward looking child, no skills in any area, no talent in any area, just, yeah, not seen as any worth.
Do you find it hard, or did you find it hard? Do you find it hard talking about that now?
Me?
Yeah.
well, it's been such a long time since I've really spoken about it. The first time I really ever spoke about it was with Dee in 2013. And I've come to learn so much, you know, since all of them, because I used to justify my family's treatment of me. And when I found out about domestic violence and, you know, people that end up in that way is generally kids that were abused. And I realized that I'd been justifying my abusers' behaviors, that I deserved it, or that was them showing me love. And walked straight into a severe domestic violence relationship because I just didn't know. You know, I do get emotional sometimes, especially doing like, you know, something like this. I didn't think I would because I really struggle to express emotions. But yeah, in hindsight, there is a lot that I still haven't dealt with. Like there's situations where I got abused quite terribly that I still have never spoken about, you know.
And that's fair. Yes.
You know, I mean, because a lot of people will understand, you know, being abused by men. A lot of people don't understand that women can be abusive as well, in more ways than one, and women can be pedophiles, definitely.
Oh no,
and
I understand that.
Yes, care leavers understand that, but the general population assume that women are going to be loving and caring. And that's not always the case, because I had both men and women abuse me throughout my life.
I understand that. Amy, how about you? Do you find it hard now, just sharing as we're sharing?
Surprisingly so. I think there are aspects of my experiences that I guess I had forgotten about or hadn't processed, because I guess, I don't know, when Stacey was saying you haven't had a chance to heal from some things, it got me thinking, well, we never will. Like you spend your entire life, the rest of your days are spent trying to heal from the experiences you have when you're young. So I'd say it's definitely easier now. When I was 18, I went straight into college in the US. I went to university, and I did try. I was going to do an internship where I was going to advocate and actually write for this magazine thing that was for kids in care. It was like a national magazine that would go to various, you know, out-of-home care agencies. And I had this all lined up as a summer internship, and I just couldn't do it. I just couldn't do it because it was just too traumatic at the time. So I'd say things are much, much easier now, years later. Time does help.
Yes.
Yeah.
Frank, would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. With both sets of comments. Personally, I mean, Jim, you mentioned that the male thing. You know, boys don't cry. If you cry, you get a bang over the head to, you know, give you something to cry about.
Yes.
The first time I cried, I was working as a staff member at the Adelaide at Teachers College in Adelaide, and I cried at the age of 40, and it was such a mystery, such a revelation that I could actually cry and it would be all right.
It's amazing.
That's the sort of steel trap that childhood built for us, I think. That you didn't show your emotions, and you concealed what you really thought in case it was the wrong thing, or you know, the people disapproved of you and so on. You so desperately, and I think you mentioned this before, Stacey, you know, that drive to actually achieve something in order to show that you can actually do what normal people do. Very, very strong, I think, in a lot of care leavers, and certainly strong in my own psyche.
I find it interesting, just by the way there with you talking, Frank, that the term normal people has been used, or normal families has been used quite extensively. And that seems to be one of the things that really does come through with care leavers and out of care, well, people who experience out of home care and whatever. The normal, whatever was normal.
Yeah.
What did you see as normal?
Well, yeah, I don't know. I think we look around. I'm speaking for myself, but maybe others will share this too. You look around and you're trying to establish what's normal. You know, what's it like to be in a normal family? What do other children do? I had a couple of friends who took me home occasionally for weekends, and I learned such a lot. You know, Friday night through to Sunday night. I'd be absorbing what it was like in this family. Now, whether they were normal or not, I can't really say. But it was as close to what I imagined real families, the way they lived, and you just grab at these things. And at the university, I went to Melbourne University, and again, you know, I hardly said boo for, I don't know, 18 months, 2 years, the first 2 years of my course. Hardly said a word because I'm too interested to know what other people are doing, what other people are saying, what's normal. That's a big learning thing.
Did you ever ask that question, Amy? What's normal?
Oh, of course. And I think I'm still learning what it is. Since becoming a mother, it has been jaw-droppingly and astonishing and just eye-opening to see what I guess these normal families function like when it comes to family support, like of your child. You know, because my daughter pretty much doesn't have connections with extended family, whereas other new moms, when I was doing the, you know, mom and baby groups, they have their mothers with them, their mothers take them so that they can have nights off, all of these things that, like, one of the women in the group was complaining that she only got 3 nights a week of babysitting. And meanwhile, I'm thinking I've never had a break. I'm in tears because I'm exhausted from never, ever, ever having a break.
Yes. So
I think that's what my interpretation of normal is. And that was actually a strong theme with my PhD interview participants as well. The young mothers had similar, I guess, it's not, I suppose it's almost envy, seeing how other people, you know, somebody throws them a baby shower, and then like the extended family come to visit you in the hospital, and there's all this support and love and encouragement that you don't get. So I'm assuming that's what normal is getting it. But that being said, like most of us, I didn't have very many people who I could say had that normal experience only until much later in life. Because the neighborhood where I grew up was also a lot, I mean, not everyone, but I guess birds of a feather tend to flock together. So I found myself in all of my placements around other young people who had chaotic families or difficult home lives, etc. So it was really only later in life, and I became a mother at an older age, considered an old mom. So I have, you know, professional background and doing a PhD now. Now I'm around people who I assume are normal, and they are wealthy and they are well connected, and they get all of this, so many benefits from that. So I'm assuming that's what normal is, or that's what they assume is normal anyway.
Yes.
Is to have all this privilege that comes with family.
Yeah, see, normal, I've never quite seen normal. Like when I was young, I used to think that normal was the sitcoms that I watched. So like watching Full House and, you know, all that sort of thing, like, you know, family interactions. That's what I thought was what normal could be. These days, I look at normal as just a distribution, and I think of it as being about 64% of the population being average, and then the others being in a standard deviation away from that. So now I see myself as a neurodivergent person, which I feel like whenever I've met other women who are autistic, we just get each other so much. We don't have to explain it. It's just this unspoken dynamic. So now, you know, I kind of feel that, you know, being normal sounds boring, very boring, because I don't want to be that 64% of average intelligence, of average, you know, just average everything. Back in the day, it was a very different perception. It was this, you know, what you'd see on a sitcom, and this loving family together, having dinner, going out together, you know, parties, you know, happiness. But now it's a distribution that I don't care for. I don't want to be a part of that 64%. Yeah.
I just want to go back to you were talking about you know, your son And when I was in the Gill, or let me say, I have a person who contacts me nearly every day who was in the Gill with me. He's intellectually impaired, and he's just a beautiful, beautiful man, and I care about him very much. He's just been through his daughter dying and a whole range of things. But when he was at the Gill, going to high school, and what happened was that because he was a homeboy, out of care, well, in care, I should say, he never went to classes. His entire schooling was spent helping the janitor, walking around picking up rubbish. And we had a big incinerator in those days where they used to burn all of the rubbish at the school. And Michael's job was to pick up rubbish and to.
Did he love that?
He enjoyed it.
Because my son loves rubbish bins. Like, he's obsessed with bins.
Look, Michael enjoyed it, and I think it was because he didn't have to go into the class and to endure, you know, what he saw as major problems. So he's had a job as a kitchen hand till he retired. He's worked. He's done. He's just a lovely bloke, but schooling for him was so different. I think that it's your son is probably having a far better experience than every day of his life.
That is why I fought for him to go into special education. So luckily he ended up going to an autism specific childcare centre when he was about 3. And then at 4, he was in a Department of Education, Children with Disabilities kindergarten. And then he got placed in the junior primary special options class for children with intellectual disabilities and autism and ADHD. And then, so you don't get to actually enroll your children when they're special. You have to wait for the education department to give you the results of their tests and place them. And I was given a letter saying that he wasn't placed in a school. So I broke down in tears, and within 2 minutes I'd given the education department about 10 phone calls. I'd contacted every PM I could find, and I basically managed to get him, you know, I got a phone call from the head of the Special Options Board saying that there was a misunderstanding and they'd given me the wrong letter, and that my son had definitely been placed in special options school.
Yes, it's
so
interesting, isn't it? Yeah.
I was so pleased because before he could talk, you know, he does a lot of, he's got a lot of motor movements. So there'll be a lot of, you know, a lot of flapping, a lot of facial and body kind of, you know, distortions and stuff like that. So, you know, the fact that he couldn't speak for such a long time, you know, was quite difficult because you can't really test non-verbal children. You know, so I'm very pleased that he got a place in junior primary, and then we went through the process again to get him into primary, and then now next year will be his last year in the special options primary, and we'll have to wait until see if he gets into a special options high school. Yeah, so I mean, he's got like the body of an 11-year-old because he's going to be 11 soon, but intellectually he's at, you know, the age of about, you know, 7. Socially he's, you know, quite unaware. But him and I kind of just get each other because we have got the same quirks. Like, he's just like a little version of me, and that's something that's also really made me think about my childhood a lot. Is he's just so similar to me, and he's such a gorgeous kid.
Just you talking about that, I just thought of all of those children who would have been in care who just suffered so much because of you know, because of things like that, and were just misunderstood, and were hit and beaten and suffered cruelly because of that.
Yes, I had a lot of sensory problems that people wouldn't understand. So when I was with, you know, the family members that were meant to be looking after me, they'd try and dress me in certain ways. And there were so many sensory issues that I had that I'd be screaming and crying from the clothes that they'd put me in. And they'd just hit me and tell me to shut the F up because I was being a naughty girl. And I would just be crying constantly, and, you know, they couldn't understand why I couldn't say the right thing. So instead of saying lighter, I'd say darker, or, you know, and just get the wrong words, you know, and everything I did was wrong basically. So I just get in lots of trouble. Whereas my son does the same types of things, but I would never get angry at him for that. It's like, oh no, Lovey, this is the way, you know. But you know, I don't see myself, like when I see myself through my son and the traits that we both share, I can't imagine why it was so hard to love me as a kid, because he's just so lovable, you know, and every kid is. I mean, I love kids so much, especially the special ones, because I don't understand how people can't look after them or love them. It doesn't make sense.
No, I look, I agree with you. Moving on, I've just been very interested with you, Frank, talking about, you know, tears and things, and I kind of experienced something similar. I went to get a passport, a common everyday occurrence. People get passports. And so I went into the passport office in Sydney, and I filled in the form, because we're talking about name changes and things like that. And as I was saying to you, my mother's name has changed. Just by the way, just on a thing like that, if you ever saw the movie or read the book, Oliver Twist, you'll find that Oliver Twist, he was called Oliver Twist because they were up to T's in the alphabet. And that was quite a common thing. The people, you worked your way down the alphabet. But I went off to get my passport, very excited. So I filled it in. My full name's Terence James Luthy. And the clerk there said to me, look, you're filling out a form here. This is for your passport. You know, you should be able to get your name right. And I said, what do you mean I should be able to get my name right? It's Terence James Luthy. He said, no, you've got to put down your whole name here. You've got another name. And I said, what? He said, look, don't you even know your name? And I didn't. So I had an extra name called Terence James Drayton Luthy. Now, the man my mother had a relationship was Frederick James Drayton. So at some time or other, she was going to drop the Luthy and I was going to become a Drayton. But I ended up inheriting a name. And you would think to yourself, and that broke me up. That really did. That I had a name that I didn't know about. I went to get a credit card or debit card or something or other from Suncorp up here. And they said, put your name in full. So I did. Terence James Drayton Luthy, filled it out. My wife got hers, Anne Marie Luthy. Mine came back, Terence James Drayton. And so I went down to see them, and they said, well, you're very strange because you have another name. We don't have enough boxes here for you. This was last year. We don't have enough spaces here for you to do this. You're going to have to be a very special case because you've got too many names. So I went from not knowing who I was to having too many. And so I inherited a name. So I don't know if that was a bit of a shock to me in living. And at the same time, I was living in a boarding house. Now, boarding houses are just terrible, terrible places. I was having to share a room with a man who had stage 3 cancer. I was a young teenager, adolescent. That was probably one of the hardest things that I've ever done. At the same time of dealing with discovering a name, sharing sharing a room, I also had friends who said, we wish that we were like you, Jim, where there were no rules. You could do whatever you I guess I wasn't a rebellious teenager because I didn't have anyone to rebel against. Could actually do whatever I wanted. You know, so when people talk about teenagers being rebellious, no, I wasn't.
Me either.
You know, just doing whatever. So I discovered a new name, having to live in a boarding house, which I eventually moved out of, and then having no rules. I think that affects us. Frank, what do you think?
What do I think about what, Jim? The terrible story?
About those things that suddenly come upon us as adolescents and teenagers and young people that affect us then for years down the track.
Yes, yes. I was
anything like that with you?
Not personally of that sort, but I do remember, and I'm having lunch tomorrow actually with an old friend who grew up with his grandfather because his parents were dead, he was told, and his sister, and he went through life until he was about 50, and then he did some research and found that his sister was in fact his mother.
Yeah.
He'd lived with his sister all that time, not knowing that it was his mother. Now, I've heard other stories a bit like that, you know, where people are shocked to discover something that was completely out of the blue. They'd lived one experience when in fact the truth was quite different.
Yeah.
I haven't had any experience of that myself. You know, my life is well documented, unlike yours, Jim. Too well documented, actually. I do know, I was very comforted to know that at the age of 2.5, when I was made an order of state, that I was free of syphilis. So I've lived my life knowing that you know, I didn't have syphilis when I was a little baby. That was a bit of a shock. I found that out when I was 60 odd, but you know, hardly life shattering because, as you said, the children were put through all sorts of medical screening processes, you know, simply because they were in out of home care and had to be therefore screened to make sure they were clean enough. Yes.
Yeah. Amy, any shocks for you?
I suppose I guess it was shocking for me to realize that my experience was more like Frank's, in that I was highly monitored. You know, that constant. I'd say there was a lot of medical care and whatnot, and psychiatric care, and kids in foster care tend to be over medicated and whatnot. But somehow my actual health issues were completely missed. So I realized later in life that I have ADHD. I was nearly 30 and I was learning about it in my teaching qualification of my master's. And they were talking about what it was like for children and students, and then what would happen later in adult life. And that's when I was like, I tick every one of these boxes. How was this missed when I had really close psychiatric, you know, constantly monitoring there? And I also have a lot of physical health issues that were missed or ignored or diminished, and it's only now in my late 30s that I'm finally taking control of my health. Part of that is that I live in Australia now, where I can get healthcare. That certainly helps. That's not something I could do in my 20s, but I just had no idea the complex level of need I had, because I was told it was fine. So it's, and that has actually changed my identity. It's not as much as learning I have a different name, but it certainly has changed the way I see myself.
Yes, yeah. Can you relate to some of this stuff, Stacey?
Absolutely, yeah. So, I mean, I never had my name changed, but I used to make my own names up. So I used to become Linda or Ariel, just from different characters that I like to watch on TV, because I never felt like I was a real person, because I was like, I always thought I was invisible or something. So I just make up names for myself. I didn't really tell anyone them because no one would really listen, but I often would just, you know, make up names. And I suppose the first big shock that I got about my childhood was when my mum actually, when I had my son. It wasn't until then, and he's 11 now, so 11 years ago I found out that my mum had me through working in a brothel with a client. Before that, she'd made up another story which never made sense to me. And I'd always ask her, Mum, it doesn't make sense. But she's a compulsive liar, so there's often stories that, you know, sound all scribbled up. But yeah, she told me this really elaborate lie about who my father was. And then I sort of said, I'd really like to know, you know, now that I know you weren't just the receptionist, is what she told me for years, that she worked as a receptionist. And it was a friend of mine that said to me, that's what they all say. And I was like, what do you mean? So they said, oh, you know, if they were all receptionists, there'd be no prostitutes. And I was like, I don't get it. So it turns out, you know, that was the first thing, is that she wasn't just a receptionist, she was a prostitute. And the fact that one of her clients was my sperm donor, yeah, so that was quite shocking for me. And it made sense as to why people would say to me in my family that I was going to be a stripper or a prostitute. Now it made sense more. And then also, yeah, getting diagnosed with autism and ADHD, that just changed my life.
Yes.
My GP was saying to me recently, if only 20 years ago we had me medicated, it wouldn't have been such an emotional wreck. Makes such a difference, you know. Like, I always knew about the ADHD and never thought the meds would help. And then I saw a psychiatrist recently, and it's made such a difference in my life. I cannot believe it. And then, yeah, I mean, the autistic diagnosis was one that shocked me, because I didn't know what it was before I had my son. So it was when everyone kept saying, oh, do you think maybe you should get tested? And I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about. But, you know, all of this kind of, yeah, like the last sort of, 10 years, basically, I've had all of these revelations, you know, and even to the fact that I didn't even know I was in out-of-home kinship care, because my family told me how lucky I was. And they kept telling me that, you know, if it wasn't for me, I would have been murdered in a orphanage. And I'm still like, oh, okay. So I'm apparently meant to be really grateful for all of them.
Yes. No, we understand that.
Yeah.
It's interesting, isn't it?
Jim,
I was thinking about, sorry, we're going to have to wrap up soon. So I wanted to finish perhaps on a note that we were talking about people dealing with out-of-home care, and the way that they've been able to do that. And I've just been, it's been really great just listening to all of you. I was thinking about how we deal with those things, and I was reminded very much of. And I mean, we're all aware of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and that bottom level there of, you know, warmth and shelter and food, and, you know, all of those kinds of things. Abraham Maslow had an interesting debate with a person called Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning, a study in existentialism. And Frankl survived five concentration camps. And the way that his story is fascinating, and I'm not going to go into his story at the present time, but there were 5 points that come out, and I think that they apply to all of us, and to people in out-of-home care who have gone and dealt and gone on. And one of the things that really interested and intrigued me and encouraged was and is the numbers of people that I meet who have been in out-of-home care and who have done such great and wonderful things. Frankl had an argument with, a debate, I should say, with Abraham Maslow, and Frankl said, look, and Maslow came to agree with him. I said, look, the very first, forget about warmth and shelter and food and all of that kind of stuff. If you don't have hope as a basis, then you're never going to succeed.
2 minutes, that's all.
And so I read the 5 points. I've obviously read Frankl. I quite enjoy his stuff, but his work's been summarised into 5 points, and I just wanted to get your views on it as things that we have done in order to become the people that we have, that we are, and that we are aiming to become, and going on from there. And the 5 points that Frankl raised was that, And as I say, Maslow agreed with him and said, yeah, well, maybe we need hope as a basis there. There's got to be hope somewhere along the line. Frankl said the first point was, we always retain the ability to choose our attitude. And I think that's a very powerful statement, isn't it? We retain the ability to choose our attitude. Does anyone want to comment on that? The ability to choose our attitude.
When I first realized that I actually had a choice in life, just in any regard, that was pretty liberating. Because I'd always had really high hope and I'd always been optimistic. And no matter how badly hurt I got, I always got back up and still had hope that there was something better out there. But sorry, I just got distracted.
No, that's fine. You're fine.
What was the first part of that question?
We always retain the ability to choose our attitude. And
yes.
Remember, Frankl's talking about this from being in Auschwitz as well.
Yeah. So I've always chosen to be happy and always chosen to look for that higher quality of life, whatever it is, and for me, the first one was, having an education to increase quality of life. And, then it's like learning all these things about how to, manage self-care and all that sort of thing to make sure I'm healthy. But yeah, just.
Yeah. Amy, what about you?
I'd say it doesn't,
the ability to choose our attitude. Yeah.
It doesn't resonate with me as strongly when I think about it in terms of mental health issues and how the choice doesn't always seem like it's there. Particularly with depression and anxiety. So, I mean, theoretically it's there. And I think it's fantastic, Stacey, that it's really admirable that you are able to continue and have always managed to continue to look for better things. But there are times when I haven't been able to, but I guess at the same time, I haven't given up and I am always constantly working towards something better. So I suppose that in a way that is having a control of my, maybe not my attitude. Well, yeah, I guess it is. I do have control of my attitude through my actions. So yeah.
Kind of like the, that poem. I always think of it like this. It's that, accept the things that you can't change and change the things that you can and know the difference. That's something that I've always sort of thought about in that regard. Because there's so much I couldn't change and there's so many things now that are out of my control if I think about it in reality. But then there's small things that I can gain control over and small things that I can do that help me sort of get to that bigger picture. But, obviously, Amy, you've had that really big drive because you've done so well. So, that's obviously you've had the drive to continue to keep doing it. And that's why you're doing so well. Yeah,
I think like Jim had said, so many of us do. So it's, yeah.
The second point that Frankl said was, in summarising his stuff, there will be suffering, but it's how we react to suffering that counts. The third point that summarises that is the power of purpose. The power of purpose. And again, I think that's a fairly, powerful thing. Yes, that having purpose. Frank, can you comment on that?
Oh yes, absolutely. I mean, 4,397 days and nights in an institution without knowing why you're there, and whether it would end or when it would end is so demoralizing.
Yes.
I like that initial thought that the four-letter word hope is so fundamentally crucial. If you're living without hope, what can you do? And that comes to purpose. Why am I here? What's going to happen? How can I get involved in making it happen, etc. So a nice four-letter word, hope.
It is indeed. The fourth point and the true test of our character is revealed in how we act. So the true test of our characters is revealed in how we act, and I guess that comes back to the first point as well. We always retain the ability to choose our attitude, and I think that's one of the things that I have gotten from care leavers, people who have lived in all of these this broad spectrum, people who have been in homes, people who have been in that residential care, people who have been in family care, people who have just been shoved into various places, is revealed, I guess, in how we act and how we respond to some of those circumstances. And finally, I wanted to give just a chance for us to comment finally on the final point. Frankel talks about this in that he's been given a slice of bread by a guard, and he's just amazed at this. And the point was that human kindness can be found in the most surprising places. Human kindness can be found in the most surprising places. And so just want to wrap up there with how we've found human kindness and how we've found it in the most surprising places, to finish on a very positive note, if we can.
In all the brutality and emotional, the emotional wilderness of a large institution, one staff member took me home one day because I was interested in this idea of glass blowing, and he took me to his mother's place and showed me how you could blow glass on an ordinary kitchen gas stove, a gas oven. And I just found that incredible. Why would a man do that when he had, 100 kids to look after?
Yes.
And totally out of the blue and no apparent purpose. Though these days I might have been a bit careful that he wasn't a pedophile grooming me, but it was an act of kindness which I've remembered.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, Amy.
The most recent thing that comes to my mind has nothing to do with my out-of-home care experience whatsoever, except I suppose that having been in out-of-home care makes me more likely to move. So yeah. I've moved 50 times as an adult or something like this, a lot. And we moved to Brisbane 3 days before the floods, and had no idea what we were doing. And it was random acts of strangers on the street. We also don't have a car and didn't drive. And as my husband was rushing to get those last minute supplies, the shopping center had already gone underwater, and a random stranger had gave him a lift to a different store so that we could get some flood supplies and get home safely. So that's just one of many examples, I think, of random acts of kindness I've experienced here in the last moving to Brisbane.
Yeah, kindness came in the form of mentors. So Dee was the first mentor I met at uni that just gave me the time of day and listened to me and understood me. And that meant a lot, just to be listened to and considered to be someone worth listening to, I suppose. So that was wonderful. And then through Dee, I managed to meet my other mentor, who's now my supervisor, because I was telling her about the book launch, and she was interested in coming along. So, she took me under her wing as well, and realized that I wasn't the traditional student, and I've just got this massive passion and drive just to do the best I can. And I mean, I'm always trying to help other people. Like, I've got nothing really to give except for, like, I can do free haircuts and colors for people, or I can, help people move house, or I can lend them this or lend them that, or I can, listen to them when they're struggling, or, whatever. But, kindness is so important, because, you feel so worthwhile if someone gives you if they listen to you or believe you. I mean, no one has believed me before. So, just those moments where there's people that see something worthwhile in you, and that kindness of them to just listen and care enough. Me and Dee have been friends now for 10 years, and, because she listened to me in her office one day.
There was a Salvation Army officer who was very kind to me. We like most kids in homes, you had a number, and my numbers was 23. It was sewn into my clothes, and my lunch wrapper was the number 23 was sewn onto everything, and so I was called simply number 23. If you have read or have seen Les Miserables, you'll know, of course, that Jean Valjean is a number, and numbers were used extensively in the home situation. A Salvation Army officer who turned up at the Gill at the start of a year. There weren't terribly many kids there. Most of them were had been on holidays or had been taken away or whatever. And he said to me, "What's your name?" And I said to him, "Look, I'm number 23." And he said, "But I refuse. I'm not calling you a number. What's your name?" And it was one of the first times that I'd ever heard a Salvation Army officer say, "What's your name?" Because I'm not going to call you a number. And he refused to hit children as well. And he was just loved by the kids there, and he garnered more respect. And kids didn't muck up for him or anything like that, because he treated them with courtesy and dignity and with kindness. And so it was in the most surprising place. In this place, I read a description of what the Gill was like, and in this terrible place, there was a person who was showing kindness and impacted and influenced me to do the same. And I hope I do that with my friend Michael, who contacts me every day, and with people that I come into contact with as well. And I remember the power of purpose. The test of character is revealed in how we act, and that human kindness can promote just so much for each of us.